Welcome to the Estate Blueprint, Planning Your Future with Tom Begley.
Welcome to the Estate Blueprint, Planning Your Future with Tom Begley, where clarity meets compassion in estate planning. Join attorney Tom Begley as he breaks down the essentials of wills, trusts, long-term care, and legacy protection. I'm your host, Sophia Morales, and today we are planning ahead, how to afford long-term care without losing everything. Welcome back, Tom. I'm so happy to have you here with me today.
It's great to be here, Sophia.
So let's start with the fundamentals. I've heard this rumor that you have to go broke in order to get onto Medicaid to have your long-term taken care of for you if something happens. Why is planning ahead for long-term care one of the most important things a family can do?
Well, planning ahead is important for two reasons. And at the outset, for this entire podcast, I think it's important for everyone to know that the laws are possibly changing in a major way. We're hoping it doesn't impact anything involving the elderly. However, right now in Congress, there's a debate between the parties as to what change should be made to the Medicaid program. So hopefully what we're talking about today is it radically changed in the not too distant future. I think we should be safe though, but anybody that's watching this podcast should be keeping their eyes and ears out for changes in the legal system, and also keep, I guess, their eyes ahead for a future podcast where we could possibly address that. Anyway, why is it important? Two things.
Yeah.
First, statistics show that 70% of us need long-term care at some point or another during our lifetime. And half of us require some of that care to be in an institutional setting. By that, I mean an assisted living facility or a nursing home.
Right.
The second reason is because insurance, typical medical insurance, does not cover long-term care. There is long-term care insurance, but only a small fraction of us actually get that. It's probably just, a few percent get that in the country. And the reason why is that for many people that require Medicaid, the cost of the insurance is just not effective for what they need. And that's not to badmouth the long-term care insurance industry. It's a product that's helped many people over the years, but it does have some limits. First, there's a lot of population that will need long-term care where the cost of the insurance is just too much out of their assets. And second, unfortunately, about last 10 years or so, premiums started to increase at times unexpectedly. And somebody was paying a level premium for 10 or 20 years, and then after they retire, they got a notice saying it was going to go up a lot. So for many reasons such as that, people are reluctant to get long-term care insurance. And many people, unfortunately, still think that there are two sources of payment that really don't do it. One is traditional insurance. Traditional insurance is great for hospitalizations and doctor's visits, but it does not pay for anything regarding long-term care costs. And Medicare, which many people think will pay, does not help at all. Medicare pays barely anything. It pays less than 1% of our long-term care costs in this country every year. Basically, there are two types of care for people that need long-term care. There's what's called skilled care, and there's custodial care. Now, skilled care is when someone, for example, has a stroke, or let's say, for example, I had a family member that had knee surgery a handful of years ago, and they needed to get rehabilitation. So they went to a long-term care facility about a mile from my office, and they were there for 20 days, and Medicare picked up the tab because skilled care is something that involves you improving and getting better. Yeah. So it's a tube under a faulty catheter, rehabilitative services, at least 5 days a week, and a few other exceptions. That coverage can be stopped after one day if the facility doesn't see that there's any improvement. But most times when it comes to long-term care, I see they do try to work with you to get the 20 days in. However, after day 20, there is no coverage, and you have to pay a copay, which is relatively substantial. It's a couple $100 a day. And so it's not free. Some people think 100 days free. You can get that if you do have what's called a Medigap or supplemental policy that allows for it. And some people do have that. But regardless of the circumstances, after 100 days, you're on your own. And that's for skilled care. Now, most people go in for what's called custodial care. And that's where someone has either a cognitive brain decline or conditions such as Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, and specifically if they have inability to handle what's called the activities of daily living, which are bathing, dressing, feeding, transferring, medicating, etc. And for custodial care, Medicare will not pay a dime. So for many people, it's very, very important to be aware of the issues involving the cost of long-term care and the fact that planning in advance is, for most people, the only way to effectively preserve the assets that you've earned during the course of your lifetime.
Yeah, exactly. We discovered that with my father when he could no longer live on his own. It was a very ugly discovery, and I scrambled quite a bit to figure out how we were going to manage to care for him. So, what does Medicaid actually help pay for when it comes to nursing homes, home care, custodial versus skilled nursing?
Okay, so what Medicaid will pay is broken down into a couple categories. What it pays for younger people that are don't have enough funds on their own to afford quality insurance on their own. Basically, it's considered a part of the welfare programs. For the purpose of this discussion, let me answer that from the category of the elderly or the people that need an institutional or I guess long-term care for the older folks. That falls into three categories. One is in-home care. The second is assisted living, and the third is skilled nursing or just nursing home care. Now, if you need a nursing home and the nursing home is Medicaid certified, which virtually all of them are, there's a handful in each state that aren't, then Medicaid will pick up the tab for everything. There's a amount that you need to contribute, which I'll discuss shortly, but overall, once you're into the facility, they pick up the tab for the care there. And by that, I mean everything: the cost of living, room and board, any doctors, nurses, visits, prescriptions, etc., rehabilitative care, you name it. The second is assisted living. Now, typically, the state will pay for all of that in New Jersey. However, there is a limited number of slots. So you could have a Medicaid certified facility. However, if there's not a slot available, you could be eligible for Medicaid, but the facility's not able to take you unless you pay privately. So, like for example, if a state has a 3,000 slots for Medicaid for assisted living and they're all full, if you're eligible for Medicaid but all 3,000 slots have been taken, you have to wait until you get off the list. I will say in New Jersey over the years that has not been a problem. It seems like that has been fairly well addressed. When we first started covering assisted living facilities in New Jersey back in the late 1990s, oftentimes there were cases where somebody would be eligible for Medicaid, but a slot wouldn't open up for 6 months, and families had to decide what we're going to do. Are we going to take mom or dad back home? Can we pay privately for the care? Or sometimes do we have to elevate their care to nursing, which quite frankly is really not ideal for someone who doesn't need that level of care. The other thing, though, that needs to be recognized about the nursing homes as well as assisted living is that there are a couple types of facilities. Some will take in Medicaid day one, but the nicer ones in general want what's called key money, or the key to get into a better facility. And that basically is anywhere from 1 to 2 years. So for example, Sophia, let's say there's a Shangri-La nursing home out there, and you and I have a massive stroke, coincidentally, on the same day, and there's one slot available at the Shangri-La nursing home, and you walk in and say, look, I've got the $15,000 a month to pay privately, and I walk in and I'll say, I've got the Medicaid voucher that'll pay about 65 cents on the dollar. You're getting to Shangri-La, and I'm going to get to a place that may or may not be ideal. There are some facilities that will take Medicaid day one, which are certainly acceptable, but there are far too many just because of the economics that really are sad, to put it nicely, to want to ever see your mom or dad or husband or wife be in.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things I ran into, and I think this is a long-standing myth, is that families have to spend down everything before the person can qualify for Medicaid. Are there ways to protect what they worked for? Because I got a lot of bad advice before I found somebody who knew what they were doing.
Yeah, well, Sophia, there are ways to protect it. Unfortunately, I typically see a lot of two obstacles in general that impair people's ability to expedite their qualification for Medicaid benefits and other forms of programs which may be of assistance. First is people aren't aware that the programs exist, and what will happen is, or they just procrastinate. And what happens is mom or dad goes to Happy Acres Nursing Home, and the kids run in to say, is there anything we can do? But, that proverbial ship has sailed. There's nothing we can do at that point because the amount of assets in question may be relatively light, and there may not be any exception because there's the 5-year lookback, which I know we'll be discussing this afternoon. On the other hand, one of the big problems that I see is what I call the street law. It's reminds me of those old Holiday Inn commercials from about 20 years ago, the Holiday Express, where somebody would show up in an operating room and the guy would say, "You're not my doctor." He says, "Well, I'm not a doctor, but I did spend last night at a Holiday Inn Express."
Right.
And that was his qualifications. We got a lot of people that are well-meaning but don't have any qualifications, and they'll tell their friends or neighbors or a client from another profession that you can do certain things that you can't, and that you can't do things that you really can. So it's important to make sure that you go to somebody that knows what they're talking about. So here are the main concepts that you need to know about getting on Medicaid. In New Jersey, there is an income cap, but I'm really not going to get too much into that because you still can get on Medicaid even if your assets exceed the quote-unquote income cap. You just have to execute a silly trust called a qualified income trust, which will allow you to get qualified anyway. It's just an example of the state making something more difficult than it needs to be.
Yeah.
The big thing is that the person who's going to go into the facility can only have $2,000 of what is known as countable assets. And countable assets is exactly what it sounds like. There's countable and non-countable. A non-countable asset is an asset the state will not count prior to determining whether or not you're eligible for Medicaid. And a countable asset is one which they will. So individuals that are single, typically their countable assets are $2,000 or less. Excuse me, their non-countable is $2,000 or less. And also they can keep personal effects such as this proverbial clothes off your back, jewelry, etc. The state's been very fair in that regard. Unless someone says they've got the Hope Diamond stuffed in the living room, the state generally doesn't make people itemize the personal effects. I think they realize that, you may have purchased a lot of things over the years that cost a lot of money, but if you had the proverbial yard sale on Saturday, you're not getting more than a couple $1,000s for it if you're that lucky. So countable assets is anything else, the house, the car, the bank accounts, brokerage accounts, you name it, cash value of life insurance. When you're married, there are additional exceptions. So if we're married, the home is considered to be an exempt resource so long as the spouse who's residing in the community, known as the community spouse, as opposed to the person who's going to go into the nursing home, who's known as the institutionalized spouse. So that person is certainly allowed to maintain their ability to live in the house. And one thing that they should do is transfer the property out of joint name into the name of the individual who's staying in the home. That's an exempt Medicaid transfer. It's not subject to any look-back period or period of ineligibility. And then when you do that, there's a will that should be prepared to make sure that if the healthy spouse dies before the spouse in the nursing home, that we minimize the amount of the equity of the house that we'd otherwise have to pay for the long-term care costs. They can also keep a car. And they can also keep a portion of the countable assets known as the community spouse resource allowance. However, that's capped at a certain amount. So we want to make sure that if we do have a substantial amount of liquid assets, we plan as far in advance as possible.
Speaking of as far in advance as possible, what is this look back rule you've been telling us about in Medicaid planning? And how does that kind of catch families off guard?
Well, there are two core concepts that have been around in regards to Medicaid applications and Medicaid planning for decades. One is called the look-back period, and the second is the period of ineligibility. So the look-back period means that when somebody applies for Medicaid, one of the questions on the application is, have you made any uncompensated transfers, i.e. gifts, in the last X number of years? Now, prior to February of 2006, that was a 3-year look-back period. Since 2006, that period has been expanded to 5 years.
Wow. So you really have to plan ahead now.
Yeah, for most people. I mean, there are some exceptions. For example, transfers made within the look-back period to certain classes can be considered exempt. There are certain spousal transfers that can be protected, for example, the house and the community spouse resource allowance. The main exemptions are for children who are under the age of 18, who are blind or who have a disability. So transfers to them come without a penalty period. But absent those circumstances in your family, then we have to make sure the planning is done in advance because the period of ineligibility is unlimited. And it's a real big issue regarding timing. Years and years ago, look-back period was 2 years, and if you did any gifting within 2 years, generally it was considered to be capped within that period. Prior to 2006, if gifts were made the penalty period was counted from the day that the gifts were made. So, for example, going back to the stone ages of time, let's say it was 2003, and Sophia, I gave you $50,000, and say back then that created a period of ineligibility for 8 months. So if I did this in June of 2003, and let's say in June of 2005, I need to go to the nursing home, you'd apply for Medicaid, and they'd say, well, did Tom make any gifts in the last 3 years? And you say yes, and you'd say you made a gift of $50,000 to me in June of 2003. And at that point, they would say, well, 8 months of ineligibility, but they would start counting in June 2003. And as a result, the period of ineligibility would end at the end of January of 2004. So they'd say, you made a gift, but the period of ineligibility is already expired. The awful thing they did in 2006 when they changed the Medicaid rules was they made the period start the day of that Medicaid application, which effectively... So I'll give you an example. Fortunately, it didn't happen to me, but a colleague of mine had an instance where mom and dad transferred a substantial amount of money. We're talking about, well over $1 million. And the son was actually a very wealthy professional, I guess, decided that rather than spend a few dollars to get a professional to handle the Medicaid application, that he was going to save a few $1,000, I guess, and do it on his own.
Mm-hmm.
As you can probably tell this is not going to end well.
This is not going to go well, exactly.
So if he had waited for 5 years and 1 day to elapse, he would have gone to the Board of Social Services of Burlington County or Camden County, wherever the nursing home was. And when they asked, did you make any gifts in the last 5 years? He could have honestly looked in the proverbial eye and said no. However, he did say that, well, yes, 4 years and 11 months ago, mom and dad made these substantial transfers to me and my brother and sister. And the amount of money that was transferred was so much that the period of ineligibility was over 11 years. So, and because they counted from the date the application was made.
Sure.
So that's an extreme example. However, using the example I just gave you, let's say it was an 8-month period of ineligibility. You applied for me, last month, and the period of ineligibility is supposed to say end either next month or the following. They would say, well, we're going to have to count the period of ineligibility starting now, and it would go out 8 months. And you'd say, well, Tom doesn't have 8 months of money. He's already given it away and he spent it.
Right.
So it really puts you in a bad position. So the key thing to do is make sure to wait the 5-year look back and do not apply until everything is past 5 years and the debt. So 2 core concepts. When it comes to the transfer of liquid assets, they look at the date a check has been cashed, not the day the check has been written.
Oh,
I wrote
ouch.
a check today on June 23rd, and you're one of those people that dawdles until July 15th, and 5 years pass, and it's time to apply for Medicaid. If you applied on July 1st, well, you're going to be subject to that 5-year penalty. You can't say the check was written on the 23rd, because the check is defined as a promise to pay, not the payment itself.
Exactly.
They would actually look at the bank statements. They would see that the check was cashed in within that 5-year period, because July 15th would be in that, and then the penalty comes about. The other is recording of real estate transfers. So a deed gets transferred to the county, and they don't look at the day of the deed. They look at the day the deed was recorded.
Right.
And that's, I guess, a little bit of skepticism that perhaps the deed was backdated. So they look at the recording date. So, and there's been a couple of attorneys that have gotten a little bit of trouble because they had somebody execute a deed in, say, April of 2023, and they didn't record the deed until 2 or 3 months later. And the deed should be recorded within a week or two if you submit them promptly.
Exactly.
And the question came about was you had to pay an extra 1 or 2 months of nursing home costs because of the person not doing things promptly, and somebody needs to pick up the tab, and the family is certainly not calling the attorney because they think they ought to.
Right. Oh, that is a real mess. So this look back window is something you need to pay really close attention to. So what happens if someone suddenly needs care and hasn't done any planning? Is it really too late? Game over?
Not always. There's 2 things that you can look for. The first thing that you can look are those exceptions that exist. Second is how much assets do they have? I mean, I have had the case where somebody comes in, and let's say the cost of the nursing home is $15,000 a month, but their monthly income between Social Security and pensions is $5,000. Well, that means we're going to be dipping into their principal about $10,000 a month. And that's obviously not including any income generated off the investments. So over the course of 5 years, that's 60 months. We're talking about 600,000. Now, really with inflation, it might be closer to 650,000. However, if that person does come to you and let's say they've got $1 million, well, we can still save the other 350. You don't have to sit around and wonder what happened 5 years after mom or dad goes to the nursing home.
Right.
And that actually brings up a really good point. And this is something I feel very firm about. There, in general, not always, but in general, the two major populations that go into a nursing home, one are the major stroke victims. And I'm not talking about the person that has a stroke, goes to rehab, and is able to go home and have some form of life. We're talking about the one which generally is going to take you out within 90 days or 180 days tops.
Right.
And I think it's important not to worry about playing at that point. I know a lot of my brethren or sisters are not going to be happy with me saying that. However, I just can't go to bed at night knowing that I asked somebody to pay me a lot of money for something where the person's going to die before they're probably ever going to be able to use it.
Right.
So the other one is individuals that have Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. Years and years ago, when I started practicing, people got dementia and they were usually gone within 7 years tops. Now it's 15 to 20 years for many people. And
Right.
also because of advances in medicine in particular, the early stages of dementia are often postponed, which allow people to enjoy some additional quality of life before they, for lack of a better term, enter into the darkness. As a result, many people, when they get what I call that warning shot, the diagnosis by the doctor that they do have dementia, it's not too late to come see the attorney then.
Yeah.
Many times I've had people come in and they say, Mom's got diagnosed with dementia, and we can move a lot of assets out because mostly, on average, people don't get into the nursing home if they need it until at least 3 years down the road. And
Right.
so by the time, let's say it's 2025, June, let's say you came in and this month we quickly did a plan and we transferred assets out of your name into, say, a trust, then we'll be looking at getting eligibility in June of 2030, but you're not going to maybe need to go to the nursing home until 2028. So a lot of times we'll do calculations based on making sure that you have enough to pay for a couple of years, but not more than that.
Yeah.
Obviously there's some level of risk and you have to come up with some contingency plans to make sure that we don't do anything that compromises the care that mom or dad need. However, I also used the 2 years to be set aside because legally you do have to tell people as an attorney that we could do some aggressive gifting and maybe get mom or dad on Medicaid on day one, but I would have trouble looking my mother or father in the eye saying that I put them into a dump just because I wanted to have a bigger inheritance. So I
Yeah.
think that frequently you want that. And also if they have some level of, they're still relatively competent, you do want to have them maintain a sense of independence. And
Yeah.
so I always tell people you want to give them what I call some walking about money.
Exactly. Thank you so much for sharing all the ins and outs of this. I know it's really complicated having been through it, lived through it myself. And so I really appreciate your wisdom.
Okay. Thanks for having me, Sophia.
Thanks for joining us on the Estate Blueprint. To learn more about estate planning or to connect with Thomas Begley and his team, visit begley3law.com. And don't forget, subscribe, leave a review, and remember the best plan is the one that starts today.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.